You are listening to Sales Optex. Visit us at salesoptex.com.
It's a painfully familiar picture. And if you're listening to this right now, there's a very good chance you've lived some version of it yourself.
Oh, I'd say it's almost guaranteed.
Right. So picture this scenario. Your organization just spent an absolute fortune on recruitment. We're talking those grueling, multi-round interviews.
The ones that take months.
Exactly. Months of searching, massive compensation packages, all to land this elite, top-tier talent. You finally get these crack sales operations analysts, brilliant engineers, strategic project managers.
People who are just completely at the top of their game.
Yes. And on top of that, you're investing heavily in cutting-edge tech to support them. The stage is totally set for massive growth. But then, day one arrives.
Day one, the honeymoon phase.
Like the honeymoon. These rock stars sit down at their desks, they open their shiny new corporate laptops, and they immediately hit a brick wall.
An incredibly thick, entirely invisible wall, and it's built entirely out of, policies, access requests, and endless approval queues.
It's so true. They want to pull a basic customer report to start mapping out some new sales territories, but they discover they need a software approval just for the analytics tool.
Which takes days.
At least.
Yeah.
Or they decide to test a new data model, but realize the necessary firewall rule change is, it's going to take 2 weeks to implement.
Yeah, and by then, the market has completely shifted.
Exactly. They just need to look at last quarter's revenue figures to help the sales team close a major time-sensitive deal. But getting a database credential provisioned, that's going to take 3 weeks. It's completely maddening.
It really is. And it's entirely pervasive across modern business, which, is the core mission of our deep dive today into the source material.
Right.
We're exploring this phenomenon that's perfectly captured by our source text. It's titled, When IT Becomes the Bottleneck.
Such a great title.
It really hits the nail on the head. The goal here is to dissect this strange, almost tragic modern paradox. Organizations are becoming increasingly secure, increasingly compliant, and governed, but simultaneously, they're completely paralyzing their own productivity.
Yeah, and we are going to look at this specifically through the lens of business agility. We really want to zero in on the dynamic between revenue-driving functions.
Like sales ops.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
A sales operations team that is frantically trying to move at the absolute speed of the market, right? And on the other side, the IT department, which is quite understandably, trying to keep the company's name out of the headlines of a major data breach.
It is a fundamental clash of organizational objectives. One side is stepping heavily on the gas pedal to drive growth,
right,
and the other side is just yanking the emergency brake to prevent a crash.
Okay, let's unpack this because our sources lay out a massive claim right from the start. They argue that the greatest barrier to organizational performance today isn't a lack of talent, and it's not a lack of technology either. It is this invisible friction that we have all just somehow accepted as the unavoidable cost of doing business.
That core premise completely flips our traditional understanding of constraints. We typically think of constraints in very tangible terms.
Like a frozen budget or a lack of headcount.
Exactly. Or outdated legacy software. But the source material suggests that the real constraint is the environment we've actually engineered. We have intentionally surrounded our best people with obstacles.
Wow, intentionally. That's a strong word.
Well, the insidious part is that none of these obstacles, none of these decisions to add friction are actually irrational in isolation.
Right, like no one in IT wakes up, pours their coffee, and thinks, I want to completely ruin the sales ops team's quarter today.
No, of course not. Every single control exists for a logical reason. Every approval workflow is added to solve a very real problem, usually, in response to an incident that happened in the past.
Right, a reaction to a past trauma.
Exactly. Every restriction was created to reduce some form of organizational risk. The issue arises when you aggregate them. When you pile them all on top of each other, the organization becomes incredibly secure, sure, but it also becomes incredibly slow.
And the cost of that cumulative slowness is what the text refers to as the friction budget.
The friction budget, yes.
I love how that frames it. Because we tend to think that adding a rule or a policy is, free. We assume it doesn't cost the company actual money to mandate that an employee now needs 3 managerial signatures to access a database instead of just 1.
But adding a control is never free. That is one of the most dangerous blind spots for modern leadership today. The cost simply doesn't show up on a standard balance sheet.
You're definitely not going to see a line item in a quarterly financial report detailing the cost of excessive IT approvals.
No, it doesn't trigger a red alert on a CFO's dashboard anywhere.
So, if it's not on the balance sheet, how is this budget actually being spent?
It's paid in small, agonizing increments of time and energy by employees every single day. The text provides some really pointed examples of this.
Like what?
Like a developer waiting 3 days just to get access to a dev environment so they can actually start writing code.
3 days of just doing nothing.
Right. Or an analyst who conceives a brilliant way to segment customers, but postpones the idea entirely because getting the raw data requires navigating 6 different approval committees.
Oh man, 6 committees. That idea is dead on arrival.
Exactly. Or a project manager delaying a critical product launch because a mundane firewall change is stuck in a ticketing system somewhere.
Think about a sales ops team in the final weeks of a critical quarter. The pressure there is just immense. The chief revenue officer needs to know exactly where the pipeline stands.
Broken down by region and product?
Yep, so they can direct the sales reps on where to focus their final push. Now, the sales ops team knows they could compile this complex report in 10 minutes if they just had this one specific automation script.
But running that script requires an exception request to the standard software policy.
Exactly. And that request gets denied by an automated system, or it just sits in a queue waiting for human review that, frankly, won't happen until next week.
So instead of a 10-minute automated process, what happens? A team of highly paid, highly skilled analysts spends hundreds of collective hours manually pulling data from different systems.
Oh, I've seen this. They're copying and pasting raw numbers into massive, super fragile spreadsheets.
Right, risking human error at every single step just to get the CRO the report they need in time.
And here is the fatal flaw in how organizations measure success. They have a massive imbalance in visibility. Let's say IT implements a new security policy that restricts unauthorized scripts.
Okay.
They can go to the executive board and present data showing, hey, this new policy reduces the likelihood of a malware execution by 0.5%.
Which is highly measurable. It's visible. It looks fantastic on a risk reduction slide deck.
But no one is bringing a slide deck to that exact same board meeting, showing the hundreds of hours the sales ops team just burned on manual reporting because of that exact same policy.
Nobody tracks that. And the text points out that every company can, and honestly must, absorb a certain amount of complexity. The friction budget isn't meant to be zero.
Right, we're not advocating for anarchy here.
Exactly. Some controls are unquestionably vital. Things like multi-factor authentication or endpoint protection on laptops.
And just for clarity, endpoint protection is the security software running locally on a machine that actively monitors for malicious behavior or unauthorized data transfers. Right?
Yes, exactly. Those things are foundational. They have proven their immense value time and time again.
Let's use an analogy here, because the standard way we talk about this, like pebbles weighing down a backpack, it feels a bit too passive to me.
I agree. What's a better way to look at it?
I think it's more like the organization has developed an autoimmune disease. Your IT and security policies are the white blood cells. Their entire purpose is to protect the body, to hunt down viruses, malware, unauthorized access.
That is a critical biological function.
Absolutely. But in an autoimmune disorder, that defense system becomes hyperactive. It completely loses the ability to distinguish between a genuine threat and healthy tissue.
Oh, that perfectly encapsulates the mechanism at play here. The security apparatus becomes so aggressive, so rigidly tuned to eliminate any possible vulnerability that it literally starts attacking the healthy, productive organs of the company.
Which are the employees just trying to do their jobs.
Exactly.
The sales ops team is treated as a potential threat vector rather than a vital organ pumping revenue through the system. The body becomes fatigued, sluggish, and eventually the whole system starts to shut down because it is spending all its energy fighting itself.
And much like a chronic illness, organizations are obsessed with boosting the immune system without ever monitoring the side effects.
Right. They just keep prescribing more medicine.
They constantly ask, what new control do we need to implement to prevent the latest threat we read about in the news? But the text stresses that they almost never ask the complementary question.
Which is?
What should we remove to restore balance?
Policies just accumulate. Approval chains grow longer. Access becomes more restrictive by default. And the result is an organization that slowly becomes harder to work within than to work for.
It's a sad reality.
Which brings us to the core tension. If intelligent leaders can see this fatigue setting in, why do they keep boosting the immune system? Why do they keep adding friction?
It stems from a fundamental structural misunderstanding of risk. The prevailing belief in many boardrooms today is that risk is something that can be entirely eliminated.
The illusion of zero risk. Let's dive into that because this is where the tension between security and opportunity really flares up. Whenever you sit in a meeting about IT governance, someone inevitably says, well, we need to ensure zero risk of exposure.
And the source material is adamant about this. Risk cannot be destroyed. It can only be exchanged for another kind of risk.
Exchanged. I want to make sure we clearly define that exchange for everyone listening. Let's say you lock down a company's data architecture so tightly that a sales operations analyst cannot query a database without running a complete gauntlet of managerial and security approvals.
Okay, so you are absolutely protecting against accidental data exposure. You are minimizing security risk.
Right, that is the risk you have chosen to reduce.
But in doing so, you have explicitly and simultaneously accepted innovation risk. You have accepted the very real probability that valuable insights will simply never be discovered.
Because it's too hard to get to the data.
Exactly. The text includes this devastating observation. No one tracks the customer opportunity that disappeared because data couldn't be accessed quickly enough.
Let's ground this in the mechanics of a real-world sales ops scenario for you listening. Imagine it's midway through the third quarter. The sales ops team spots a sudden, unexpected macroeconomic shift.
Okay, the market is moving.
Right. A major competitor just announced a massive pricing increase, and there's this fleeting, tiny window to pivot your sales territories, reallocate account executives, and capture a huge segment of disgruntled accounts.
That's a massive opportunity.
Huge. But to model this pivot accurately, the ops team needs to merge their live CRM data with an external demographic data set using a specific predictive modeling tool.
A process that in most companies requires a new database credential and authorization to run an unapproved modeling application.
Exactly. So they put in the request to IT, and they wait. The market continues to move. The competitor realizes their pricing mistake and offers discounts, or maybe another agile company swoops in and grabs those accounts first.
And the window closes.
Totally closes. By the time IT finishes their vendor risk assessment and grants the credential 3 weeks later, the opportunity is gone. The company successfully avoided a theoretical, perhaps highly unlikely, data leak. But in doing so, they guaranteed a massive tangible revenue loss.
This highlights the really dangerous asymmetry in how organizations evaluate outcomes. Because security incidents, data breaches, compliance violations, regulatory fines, they are incredibly visible.
Oh yeah, they make the evening news.
Right. They generate negative press, they trigger emergency executive sessions, and they lead to public postmortems. The impact is immediate, quantifiable, and frankly, terrifying to leadership.
But I have to push back here on behalf of every Chief Information Security Officer listening. Let's play devil's advocate for a second. We are talking about the SEC mandating strict cybersecurity disclosures now. CISOs can face personal liability for negligence.
That's very true. The stakes are high.
So a slow sales ops team is bad, absolutely. Missing a market window hurts revenue. But a front-page data breach where millions of customer records are leaked on the dark web, that is an extinction-level event for a company. Isn't it their strict fiduciary duty to prioritize security over operational speed?
Well, what's fascinating here is that history actually tells a very different story regarding existential threats.
Really? How so?
Yes, cyber threats are severe and they absolutely require robust defense. But if you analyze the corporate graveyard, it is overflowing with companies that failed, not because they suffered a catastrophic cyber attack, but because they became too slow to adapt.
Oh, they just stagnated.
Exactly. Markets shifted, new technologies emerged, consumer expectations completely evolved, and these companies simply couldn't pivot their operations fast enough. The text argues that the organizations struggling the most today aren't necessarily the least secure. They are the least agile.
So agility is a survival metric, just as critical as security. They aren't opposing forces. They are both required to keep the company alive.
Precisely. The goal should never be to eliminate risk, because the only way to achieve zero security risk is to unplug the servers and close the business.
Right. Chuckles. Put the computers in a concrete bunker.
Exactly. The goal, as the text outlines, is to decide deliberately and transparently which risks are worth accepting in pursuit of the organization's mission. Moving too slowly is a massive existential risk. The healthiest organizations recognize that both security risks and agility risks demand an equal seat at the executive table.
Which brings us to the ultimate modern stress test for this entire dynamic. The perfect collision between rigid IT control and the desperate need for business agility. I am talking about generative AI.
Oh, yes. Generative AI was a complete shock to the system.
Almost overnight, employees everywhere, including those sales ops analysts desperately trying to model territory changes, suddenly had access to a tool that felt like magic.
You really did.
They could paste in massive, messy spreadsheets and have them analyzed in seconds. They could draft complex internal communications, summarize 100-page strategy documents, and even write complex Python code to automate their own daily workflows without needing an engineering degree.
For the workforce, it was like suddenly being handed a tireless, incredibly capable new teammate. The productivity gains were immediate, visceral, and just undeniable.
Right. But IT, security, and legal departments looked at the exact same technology and saw an absolute nightmare scenario.
Because they understood the underlying mechanics of how these public models actually work.
Exactly. When a sales ops analyst pastes a list of top-tier enterprise clients and their revenue figures into a public AI chatbot to ask for an analysis, that proprietary data is instantly leaving the corporate perimeter.
It is sitting on a third-party server, and it might even be used to train future iterations of that public model.
Meaning your company's highly sensitive financial data could potentially be regurgitated to a competitor who asks the right prompt.
Which is terrifying. The source text is very fair here, though. It explicitly states that these concerns were completely legitimate. There was a massive gray area around copyright, regulatory compliance, and data sovereignty.
Yeah, ignoring those risks would have been incredibly irresponsible for any IT department.
Absolutely. So, faced with this sudden influx of a powerful but highly risky technology, what did IT do?
They executed their standard, deeply ingrained reflex action. They blocked it entirely.
They restricted access to AI domains on corporate networks. They deployed endpoint security updates to disable unauthorized browser extensions. They issued blanket company-wide policies strictly prohibiting the use of any generative AI tool until further notice.
And from a purely traditional security perspective, that response made perfect sense. It immediately halted the visible threat. It stopped the bleeding.
But here is the critical failure in that logic. From a human behavioral perspective, it changed absolutely nothing about the actual demand for the technology.
Because employees didn't suddenly forget that AI existed. That sales ops analyst didn't stare at a massive disorganized spreadsheet and think, you know what, I actually enjoy spending 4 hours doing this VLOOKUP by hand.
Right, they just looked for a way to get their speed back.
And that leads directly to the consequence. Shadow IT. The technology didn't disappear from the company, it just disappeared from IT's field of vision.
The text details exactly how employees circumvented these blocks, and the mechanics are simple but really devastating to security. Employees realized the corporate Wi-Fi was filtering the traffic, so they just started pulling up the AI tools on their personal smartphones over cellular networks while sitting right at their desks.
Or they bypassed the corporate network entirely. They started tethering their corporate laptops to their personal mobile hotspots.
Yes. Or they emailed sensitive data sets to their personal Gmail accounts so they could run the AI analysis on their home computers.
Which is completely outside the purview of the company's endpoint protection.
Completely blind. They scoured forums for obscure, newly launched AI tools that IT's filtering lists just hadn't caught yet.
The desire to solve problems and work efficiently rarely disappears just because a corporate policy dictates it should. It behaves exactly like water. When it hits a dam, it simply finds another path.
And it often carves out a much more dangerous route in the process.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the text points out, this isn't a new phenomenon unique to AI. This is a deeply ingrained historical pattern of human behavior in the workplace.
Oh, we have seen this exact dynamic play out over and over again.
Exactly. When IT blocked early file sharing services because they couldn't control the data, people just started emailing massive sensitive documents to their personal accounts.
Right.
When official cloud storage was deemed too risky, suddenly everyone was carrying unencrypted USB drives on their keychains. When modern agile messaging platforms weren't approved fast enough, teams simply spun up unofficial WhatsApp groups to coordinate highly confidential product launches.
Security professionals use the term shadow IT to describe this, and historically it's almost entirely framed as a discipline problem.
Like it's a behavioral issue.
Exactly. The narrative is usually, look at all these rogue employees intentionally breaking the rules. We need stricter enforcement, better monitoring, and harsher penalties.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the source material completely reframes shadow IT. It proposes something radical. Shadow IT is not a governance problem. It is a symptom of operational failure.
It really is. People rarely bypass approved corporate systems because they get some kind of thrill out of breaking the rules.
Right, they're not malicious hackers.
No, they bypass them because the official approved path no longer allows them to do the job you hired them to do efficiently.
When otherwise responsible, dedicated employees, the exact top-tier talent you spent millions recruiting, are consistently seeking complex technical workarounds, the organization has to ask an incredibly uncomfortable question.
What is driving them to take these risks?
Exactly. The text points out that frequently, the approved process has become so overwhelmingly burdensome, so saturated with the friction budget, that the unauthorized workaround feels like the only rational option to meet their deadlines.
So taking it back to the Gen AI stress test, what is the right approach? If blocking it just drives the behavior underground into shadow IT, where it's entirely unmonitored, how do successful agile organizations handle it?
Well, the organizations successfully navigating this haven't simply abandoned governance. They haven't thrown their hands up and said, hey, do whatever you want with our data.
Right, that would be disastrous.
They have fundamentally changed the purpose of their governance. Instead of asking the restrictive binary question, how do we prevent employees from using AI, they pivot to the enabling question.
Which is, how do we enable employees to use AI safely?
That is a massive paradigm shift.
Yeah.
How do we enable this safely? Because one approach relies on brute force restriction and drives behavior into the shadows, while the other creates capability, provides secure enterprise licenses, and keeps the behavior exactly where IT can see it, monitor it, and manage it.
And if you fail to make that shift, if you continue to rely on accumulating friction to manage risk, you don't just lose speed in the short term. You start inflicting a profound, long-term psychological toll on your workforce.
Which brings us to the silent killer of productivity.
Yes.
This part of the text really resonated with me because we are moving from the technological architecture, firewalls, endpoint security, AI models, to the deeply human impact.
The psychological cost.
Right. The text argues that most organizations have absolutely no idea how much of their highly paid workforce is not actually working, but simply waiting.
Waiting for access to be granted. Waiting for an architectural review board to meet. Waiting for a software license to clear procurement.
Waiting for someone in another department to open a ticket, read it, and click a button that says approve.
And individually, IT looks at their metrics and says, well, our SLA, our service level agreement for database access is 2 business days. We hit that target 95% of the time.
They assume the employee simply pauses their work, effortlessly switches to another highly productive task, and then resumes the original project the exact moment the approval comes through.
But anyone who has ever done deep knowledge work knows that is absolutely not how the human brain functions.
Not at all.
Knowledge work relies entirely on momentum and flow state. Consider a data scientist testing a complex hypothesis, or an engineer debugging a convoluted piece of code.
Or that sales ops analysts building a multi-layered predictive model.
Exactly. They are holding dozens of interconnected, highly abstract variables in their working memory all at once. They are following a fragile chain of logic. The text emphasizes that deep problem solving absolutely thrives on uninterrupted, iterative progress.
So when that momentum is violently interrupted by a hard stop or required approval that forces a context switch, the true cost isn't just the 48 hours ticking away on the SLA clock.
No, the true hidden cost is measured in shattered context.
Shattered context.
By the time that access is finally granted 2 days later, the analyst has lost the delicate nuance of why that specific query mattered in the first place. The engineer has been forced to move on to a different, unrelated task, and now has to spend hours just rereading their own code to reacclimate to the original problem space.
And the project manager has had to reprioritize their entire week. The initial spark, that moment of intellectual flow that drove the request, is completely dead.
The IT department sees a green check mark on their SLA dashboard. The employee experiences a week of fragmented, frustrating, low-quality output.
And when you multiply that cognitive tax by thousands of employees over months and years, you aren't just slowing down individual tasks. You are severely degrading the entire organization's ability to learn, adapt, and execute.
The text goes even deeper into what I consider the most tragic consequence of this accumulated friction. It explores the behavioral shift that happens when good employees stop trying.
Yeah, this part is heavy, because people don't usually quit their jobs the first time they hear no.
No, they don't become actively disengaged after one tedious multi-week approval process either.
They don't immediately walk out the door, so what happens?
They adapt to their environment. But they don't adapt by becoming more productive or innovative. They adapt by lowering their own expectations.
Wow.
They learn, through repeated exposure to friction, which ideas are safe and won't require a bureaucratic fight. They map out which departments are nightmares to work with and simply design their projects to avoid them entirely.
They figure out which initiatives require so much cross-functional coordination that they are doomed to drown in ticketing systems, so they just quietly choose not to propose them.
Think about your own internal monologue for a moment. As you were listening to this, how many times recently have you looked at a broken process, had a spark of an idea for a much better solution, and instead of asking yourself, is this a good idea? You immediately asked yourself, is this worth the effort of getting it approved?
That shift in internal monologue is the sound of an organization dying from the inside out. Is this a good idea? Is the engine of innovation? Is this worth the effort? Is the engine of learned helplessness, extreme caution, and self-censorship?
It is a devastating irony. Companies spend literal millions recruiting people specifically because they're naturally curious. They want rule breakers, innovators, disruptors.
They design interview questions specifically to find people who constantly ask, hey, there has to be a better way to do this.
And then once they successfully get them in the building, they use the friction budget to systematically condition them to stop asking questions.
They train them to self-censor, keep their heads down, and just accept the bureaucracy.
And as the source material notes, once that mindset of learned helplessness sets in, you can't fix it just by removing a few approval steps. Rebuilding the belief that good ideas are actually worth pursuing, that the system will support rather than obstruct them, is incredibly difficult once trust is broken.
So, we have painted a rather bleak, but I think highly accurate picture of the modern enterprise. We have an overgrown friction budget, a delusion about zero risk, generative AI driving a wedge into shadow IT, and a highly paid workforce that is slowly having its spirit crushed by ticketing queues.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. If the system is unintentionally breaking the company's ability to compete, how do we reverse engineer this?
We have to fundamentally alter the definition of IT's mandate. This is the pivot point in the source material. We need to move toward refactoring governance entirely and positioning IT as a true force multiplier for the business rather than a gatekeeper.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics of the solutions. How does an IT department actually transition from being known as the Department of No to a force multiplier?
It starts with acknowledging a profound shift in reality. Technology isn't just the plumbing of the business anymore. For most modern organizations, technology is the business.
Right, it's everything.
Every single function, sales operations, modeling territories, marketing deploying campaigns, finance, closing the books, depends entirely on software, automation, and data access.
Therefore, IT's primary mission can no longer be limited to how do we keep the technology safe? It must evolve to how do we enable people to do their best work safely?
But to enable people, IT first has to untangle the massive knotted mess of rules they've already created. And the text offers a fascinating explanation for why we have so many rules in the first place, using an economic concept called path dependence.
Path dependence. Let's explain what that looks like in a corporate setting.
Path dependence is crucial to understand because it proves that bureaucracy isn't usually born from malice or incompetence. Let's compare it to technical debt in software engineering.
Okay, I like this analogy.
When a developer writes a quick, messy piece of code to fix an immediate bug, it solves the problem today. But if they never go back and rewrite it properly, that messy code makes every future update harder and slower. You accumulate debt.
So organizations accumulate policy debt.
Exactly. An external audit finding happens, so IT quickly introduces a new manual review layer to appease the auditors.
A data breach makes headlines in their industry, so leadership panics and tightens default access controls across the board.
A specific software vulnerability is found in one application, so they strictly limit installation rights on all employee laptops. Every rule is essentially a scar from a past trauma.
But here is the problem with policy debt. While organizations are highly reactive and great at adding new rules to address new traumas, they never go back and delete the rules for traumas that are no longer relevant.
The text uses a brilliant analogy here. Imagine if a city's traffic management system worked the exact same way corporate IT governance does.
Oh, this is good. Tell me.
Every time there is a fender bender at a specific intersection, the city adds a four-way stop sign. Every time a resident complains about someone driving too fast, they lower the citywide speed limit by 5 miles per hour.
Every time there's congestion, they add another red light.
And they never, ever remove anything.
What happens? After a few decades of this, you literally couldn't drive across town. You would be stopping every 10 feet. You've eliminated the risk of high-speed collisions, sure, but you've completely destroyed the purpose of the road network.
That is what path dependence looks like in an organization. You are forcing your employees to operate based on layers and layers of historical decisions, many of which solve problems that quite literally no longer exist.
Because the underlying technology has completely changed. We migrate our infrastructure to the cloud, we adopt AI, we rewrite our core applications, but the policies governing how employees interact with them are still stuck in 2014.
So what does this all mean for a modern IT leader? How do they clear the traffic jam and pay down that policy debt?
Yeah, what's the first step?
The text advocates for treating governance exactly like we treat modern software development. It shouldn't be carved in stone and forgotten. Governance must be continuously reviewed, tested against reality, refactored for efficiency, and crucially deleted when it no longer serves a net positive purpose for the business.
And the practical, technical application of this philosophy is what the text calls designing for trust.
Designing for trust, yes.
How does an IT department actually shift from gatekeepers to enabler under the hood? What are the specific mechanisms?
The primary mechanism is removing the human bottleneck from predictable, low-risk requests. The text is very clear on this. Organizations must start using manual ticket queues for repetitive standard tasks.
Instead of requiring a human being in IT to read a ticket, evaluate it, and click approve for every single software request, they should implement self-service software catalogs.
Yes, exactly.
So if a sales ops analyst needs a standard data visualization tool, and that tool is pre-vetted for security, they just click a button and it installs instantly. No ticket, no SLA, no waiting.
But it goes deeper when we talk about access rights, which is always the massive bottleneck for our sales ops friends dealing with sensitive data. The solution here is moving away from static permissions to just-in-time administrative privileges.
But wait, let me push back on this, because automating database access sounds terrifying to a security professional.
It does sound scary at first.
If we automate access to our financial databases, what happens if the automated vetting gets it wrong? Aren't we just building a highly efficient automated pipeline for a catastrophic data breach?
That is a critical question, and it's why the architecture matters so much. We aren't automating permanent, unfettered access. We are automating scoped, temporary access based on zero-trust principles.
Okay, walk me through how that mechanism actually works.
Let's say the sales ops analyst requests access to query the customer database. The automated system doesn't just hand over the keys permanently. It checks their identity via Active Directory. It checks the specific data classification of what they are trying to access.
Right.
If it meets the criteria for their role, the system uses a secrets manager to generate a unique temporary database credential.
So it creates a password that only exists for this specific request.
Exactly. It provisions the access, but that credential is computationally programmed to self-destruct in, say, 4 hours.
Oh, wow. That's brilliant.
Furthermore, it might only grant row-level access, meaning the analyst can see the aggregated revenue numbers they need for their model, but the system automatically masks the personally identifiable information.
Like the names and credit card numbers of the customers.
Yes. The risk is heavily minimized because the blast radius is small and temporary, but the friction for the employee is zero, because the entire vetting and provisioning process happened in milliseconds via API integrations.
The text also mentions integrating AI assistants to actively guide employees through compliance, rather than just slapping them with a 50-page PDF policy they have to read before proceeding.
Yes, this is a brilliant application of technology. Imagine an employee trying to share a sensitive document with an external vendor.
Happens every day.
Instead of blocking the action and throwing up a generic error message, an internal AI chatbot integrated directly into Slack or Teams intercepts the request.
Okay, so it steps in natively.
Right. It pings the employee and asks 3 simple natural language questions about the nature of the sharing. It determines the risk level, and if it's low, it automatically provisions the secure sharing link. If it's high risk, it routes it to the specific security analyst required with all the context already gathered.
The core philosophy underlying all these mechanisms is recognizing that risk is a broad spectrum, not a simple binary toggle.
That is the crucial takeaway. Not all risks are created equal, and they shouldn't be treated equally. A request from sales ops to install a standard, industry-recognized data visualization tool on their laptop should not require the same level of scrutiny, the same forms, and the same executive sign-offs as a request from an engineer to modify the core production code of your financial systems.
But in a highly path-dependent organization operating on policy debt, both of those requests often get routed through the exact same clunky multi-step workflow. High-performing organizations differentiate. They create fast, intuitive, automated paths for low-risk requests, reserving human scrutiny for where it actually matters.
And when you design for trust and create those fast, intuitive paths, you naturally eliminate the incentive for shadow IT.
That makes total sense. If the official approved way to get an AI analysis or a database query takes 5 minutes and is easy to use, no one is going to bother tethering their laptop to their phone and sneaking around to do it on an unauthorized platform.
When the technology actively enables rather than obstructs, compliance naturally becomes the path of least resistance. You don't have to force people to be compliant with threats of punishment. It simply becomes the easiest, fastest way for them to get their work done.
This has been an incredibly deep and vital exploration. We have dissected the hidden compounding costs of the friction budget, how the organizational autoimmune response attacks productivity.
We've dismantled the dangerous illusion of zero risk and seen how the obsessive pursuit of absolute security can paralyze agile teams, directly causing lost revenue.
We examined how generative AI acted as a massive stress test, proving that rigid restriction simply drives behavior into the unmonitored depths of shadow IT. We also uncovered the tragic, silent cost of shattered momentum.
How endless context switching destroys flow state.
Exactly, and how the friction budget slowly trains our brightest, most innovative people to succumb to learned helplessness and self-censor their best ideas.
And finally, we detailed the mechanical path forward, treating governance like technical debt that must be paid down, breaking free from path dependence, and redesigning IT to be a true force multiplier through automated, just-in-time access and zero-trust architecture.
The source text leaves us with a vital, clarifying question. It's a stress test that every leadership team should be applying to their operations right now.
I love this question.
If we were designing our organization from scratch today, knowing what we know now, with today's technology, today's threats, and today's opportunities, which of our existing policies and approval processes would we actually choose to build again?
That is a phenomenal filter for identifying policy debt.
And it brings me to a final provocative thought for you to mull over. We know that right now, IT leadership is judged on and compensated for system uptime and zero security breaches.
Their bonuses depend on nothing bad happening.
But what if we fundamentally changed the scorecard? What if, starting tomorrow, a substantial portion of an IT leader's compensation was directly tied to the measurable hours of friction they successfully removed for revenue-generating teams like sales ops?
That changes everything.
What if velocity unlock and time to access became just as important a metric on the executive dashboard as threats neutralized? Because until we actively incentivize the subtraction of rules, we are going to keep suffocating under the crushing weight of addition.
You manage what you measure, and you get exactly the behavior you compensate for. That is the paradigm shift required to survive.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll leave you with the ultimate conclusion from our source material. Organizations do not become exceptional by accumulating process and avoiding all risk. They become exceptional by actively designing an environment that makes it as easy as possible for talented people to accomplish extraordinary things.